All right, just as a reminder, this is the quick run through of Chapter 6, Governance and Risk. This should not be the first time you've heard this material. This is just a run through. We're not going to stop for any of the videos or do anything, any of the extras. This is just your quick hit review of the material after you've studied and as you're getting ready for the exam. So in Chapter 6, we talk about governance and risk. Now, if you read the introduction, it's going to tell you about how, some people think that compliance requirements are busy work or just documentation, but it really isn't. There's um, different industries have different things that they need to make sure that they're looking out for. So when you're moving into the cloud, it gives you extra tools that you didn't have at your fingertips before. And so, depending on what type of organization you work for, if you work for a large organization or an organization that's in certain industries, um, it's not going to be considered busy work or just documentation. You're going to be using these tools to make sure that you're following your governance and your compliance standards. So let's jump in here. So some discussion topics we're going to talk about here, governance and risk. So again, in our introduction, it mentions a few pieces of compliance that are the big ones, but there are hundreds out there. When you get out there, it depends what industry you're in and what type of company you work with, to determine what you're looking out for. So some of the ones it mentions is PCI. This is payment card industries. So any organization that controls payment cards, they're going to be concerned with these. And then we have FedRAMP. These are government things where government says that it has to be a certain level of FedRAMP in order to operate in certain industries. And then it went in and started talking a little bit about some of your security things like zero trust. So there are different security certifications that you can get for your programs and applications. So some of the subjects that we're going to cover is recognizing risk management concepts related to cloud services, and then explain the policies and procedures. So one of the first things that we need to do here is look at the definition of risk, threats, and assets. And so we need to do this to make sure that we have an understanding of what these are. So risk is a high probability here's an example. Risk is a high probability of employees unintentionally interacting with malware in today's connected workforce. Employees digitally interact with others via email, sharing of files, or web pages. And so that is an example of a risk. And then an example of a threat is immediate harm, would be loss of company data and files. Secondary would be loss of employee time. Both employees who become infected with the IT employees infected and the IT employees' time to recover the company's data in the employee's infected device. And then an asset is a physical device. And so in this case, the company data and the employees. And then here are some non-IT related risks. High probability of car being stolen if parked in a busy parking lot with keys lying in the front seat. The threat is immediate loss of vehicle and potential damage. And then the asset is the vehicle. So that just gives you the definition of what we look at when we're talking about risk, threats, and assets. So in here, we're looking at our risk assessment. So this is on page 218 in your book. So we're not going to stop and discuss this here, but if you're running through this review, skim over page 218. Of course, you're going to skim through the whole chapter and understand what a risk assessment is. And then our asset inventory. This is like our hardware versus our software, and our physical versus virtual. So hardware should be something you can touch. Software is like an operating system or applications. This can be purchased or built. And then data is specific to your business. So just to point out, I think that most of you probably understand this, but when you're talking about software, you're of course talking about software packages that you purchase like Microsoft Office and the things that you put out there, and then you double click on an application and you start using it. But then when you're getting into IT, you'll find that organizations have lots and lots of software that they have built, and maybe they built it just for their own employees. So when you're talking about software, it's not just software packages that you go purchase, it's also the types of software that your company has and owns and run exclusively. All right, a couple of different classifications. So this is our risk classifications: hardware, software, and data. So if you look over here in table 6.3, when we're talking about our assets, so like one of the assets is the data center, and the threat is loss of network connectivity, and the classification would be a very high level. That loss of our network and connectivity is a high level of risk. And then we have our company vehicles, and a threat is, somebody steals one from the parking garage, and our classification level would be a 4 on that. Then we have our office supplies, and that's used for non-business related projects. That's worrying about people taking office supplies is a lower risk level. Laptops and mobile devices, loss or theft from remote employees, and that's a little bit higher. That's a 3. And then our office space, loss of power, that's a 1 because we should have some kind of uninterrupted power supply running in our office. And then some more things here, just mainly verbiage around our risks, our risk classification. We have our ownership, that's the risk owner and the asset owner, risk response, that's mitigation, acceptance, avoidance, and transfer, and then documentation. So let's dig a little bit more into these. Ownership. So usually it has one owner and usually a department head or director. And the reason you do want to put this down is it has one owner is then it's easier to hold one person accountable, and then that person will own that risk and take total responsibility for it. And then the asset owner, this is the person that actually owns the asset that's in risk. So like product owner, data owner, or information owner. And then when we're talking about a risk response, so in general, there are 4 responses to risk: mitigation, acceptance, avoidance, and transfer. That's not just limited to this book. Whenever you're talking about risk, those are pretty standard across the board. So there are only 4 things you can do with a risk. You can mitigate it, meaning that you fixed it, or you reduce the risk to where it's acceptable. An acceptance. This means that either the risk is low or the probability is low. So you just accept the risk. You just say, if it happens, it happens. We'll deal with it then. Avoidance. This is preferred. The risk is nullified and no damage or loss of the asset. And then the last one here, transfer, where you transferred to a third party. So one good example of transfer is like insurance. So if I'm worried about an asset like my car, I get insurance on it, and I've transferred that risk so that if I get in a wreck, insurance is going to pay off on that. Then we have our documentation with our findings. So whenever you do find something, you have a root RCA, which is a root cause assessment. And this is an investigation and determination of what happened. And then we also have our risk register, which is important to document risk, just as important to read about historical risk. So here are some more concepts related to cloud services. So some example of a risk register entry. So we have a column that's called ID, and this is just a unique identifier so that when you're talking about the risk, you know which one you're talking about. And then a description of the risk at a high level. And then you have the threat, details of the threat or the vulnerability of the assets, impact, nature of the risk, and the harm or damage of the asset. Assets is a list of the assets that are affected by the risk. Likelihood, this is the probability that the risk would occur. And then a grade level, either numerical or alphabetical, and it's a representation of what is the risk and how bad would it be if it were to happen. Then you have your owner. This is the person who owns the risk. The response, details of the chosen risk and the response that you would do if the risk does happen. The date is created, change log, and date modified. Now, I think that you probably already get this concept, but just in case, I want to talk about this. So when we talk about risk, we're not talking about things that have actually happened. When we come up with risk, we're talking about things that could happen. So it seems easy enough when you go by that definition, but the organizations often struggle with that definition. And when people are running projects and doing work, An issue is something that is happening right now, and a risk is something that could happen. So, again, pretty simple definition, but always make sure that when you're talking about risk, you're not talking about something that has already happened. You're talking about something that could happen. So, two other risk when you're dealing with cloud services, we've talked about this vendor lock, or as our book refers to it, as vendor lock in. Vendor lock in is the difficulty of switching from one vendor to another because of proprietary hardware or software provided by the vendors. Um, Now, I'm an old IBMer and I love IBM, but I will say that a lot of companies through the years have found that once they outsource something to IBM, it's very, very difficult to bring it back because IBM will make not, I mean, they'll make the changes that the customer has asked for. And then years later, if somebody wants to take that application back or move it somewhere else, companies like IBM don't have to do that. And maybe it'd be very difficult to do that. So people are very careful that when they ask a vendor to do something, that they do it in a way that they can pull it back if they wanted. So anyway, that's one definition of vendor lock-in. Another would be in our cloud world. Let's say that we moved a bunch of stuff into Amazon and we were using Amazon services. And then we decided that we want to move everything out of Amazon and go into Google. Well, if you started using Amazon services, it would be very, very difficult because there may not be a one to one way. I mean, it's all possible. You can do anything you want in the cloud, but if you start buying into one vendor, you might find yourself very difficult to pull out and go to another one. Then another concept here is data portability. This is where it's difficult to port data from one vendor to another. So keep in mind, we're talking about risk. That's why we're talking about these. These are just two more risks that when you're talking about cloud that need to be in your risk register. And you need to determine what you're going to do about that risk. And in a lot of cases, it's acceptance. You say, yes, there is a risk. We are moving into this. And if we ever want to move out of this cloud service provider, it will be difficult and we'll deal with it then. All right, now a little bit on the policies or procedures. So, policies are thoughts or ideas or principles that give a direction for actions to be performed by individuals or organizations as a whole. So some example here is sexual harassment, anti-bullying, wellness, anti-smoking, etc. These are all examples of policies. And then policies are defined by what qualifies as certain actions, for example, sexual harassment, bullying, etc. This definition is often the standard to determine what course of action is to be taken. And the course of action is a procedure. So then here we're talking about procedures. These are steps that should be taken once an event takes place or steps that need to be taken to follow a policy. So if an individual believes they have been sexually harassed after reviewing the sexual harassment policy, then they are to follow the sexual harassment claim procedures. So that's the difference between policies and procedures. Policies are what the company will stand for, what is standard practice, and then the procedures are what you follow once you determine that a policy was broken, or the procedures are the what you would follow to ensure that policies are not broken. All right, a little bit more on this standard operating procedures or SOP. And again, these are just vocabulary terms, things you need to know. So, SOP is standard operating procedures. Essentially, this is like a book of rules that you say this is our within our standard operating procedures. Whenever this event occurs, this is what we do. Change management. There's entire courses that could be taught over change management. But change management, in short, is where whenever you're going to make a production change, you log a change record. And in some cases, you have to get that record approved. And then you go in and you make the change in the environment. This is so important because if you don't have anybody that are making really good change management procedures, um, if somebody makes a change and let's say there's an issue and you go back and you check the change log and there's nothing listed. Well, if somebody put in a change and it wasn't listed, they're going to cost your company lots and lots of time and lots of resources while you're chasing down what actually happened. So you want to make sure that you have good change management That can include change procedures, and it can also have some automated tasks to ensure that it's followed. Then we have resource management. This is how we manage all of our resources, human resources and computer resources. And then we have our security policies, which again, in short, is just policies around what we do with our security. And it also includes tools that we might use, lots and lots of things inside that security policy. Now we talked about incident response. We're going to have 3 steps here that are coming up. And as I've kind of talked to you guys before about incident, so incident is the team and the procedures and the people that you have in place whenever something doesn't happen that's right. So, you might think of it like a help desk. So you call into the help desk, and the help desk person helps 1 or 2 people that are having an issue. But if multiple people are having an issue, if an entire department is having an issue, then you would bring your incident response team in, and the steps that they have here: detection and identification, response and reporting, and then recovery and remediation. So essentially, what it's saying is somebody identifies the problem, you respond to it, and inside of that reporting section is where whatever you learn from this incident, you put into your knowledge base. And the next time you have the similar type of incident, you can go pull from the knowledge base and hopefully get through incidents faster. Some more policies here: access and control policies. Access and control policies are a subset of security policies. They will be some of the most important in the bulk of security. Access and control policies spell out how an organization's asset can access and change other assets owned by the organization. So here in our table 6.7, access and control policy. So we have a control type, preventative and access controls. These are controls that actively attempt to block or prevent any security events from occurring. Think of door locks, data classification, penetration testing, etc. Then we have our detective access controls that detect when security event occurs. Some security events cannot be prevented, or an unknown security event occurs. Think of motion detectors, security cameras, logs, honeypots, audit trails. And then the last one here, connective access controls. These are controls that return assets to normal operating state after a security event occurs. Think of anti-malware, backup, and restore, and active intrusion detection. All right, and then in 6.8, we have our ACL categories: read, write, execute. So, what these are providing who can do what once they're in. So think of, like, if you put a file out there, let's go back to like our music example. Some people could write it. Your application can put new files out there for people to download and listen to. You wouldn't want other people to be able to write to it. You would just want them to be able to double click on it and make it work. So when you're talking about these ACL access control lists, you have read, write, or execute. Read means that you can only look at it. Write means that you can write over it and update it. Execute means you can only execute the file. More here on policies and procedures. So department specific policies and communication policies. Again, these are all just different types of policies that we want to be able to put in place to ensure that our company is running in the way that we intend it to be. So here's the summary. So we covered a lot in this chapter. Again, this chapter is one of those you probably want to read over. It's better to be taking in reading than just listening to the lecture. But in this chapter, we talked about some technical things and some non-technical things. So it's important and needed. The things that we learned are important and needed for the exam. So we started out the chapter with compliance and the importance it plays in an organization. And then we discussed what it requires to be compliant and gave examples of PCI, DSS, which list the requirements for processing credit cards. Risk. So we talked a little bit about risk management. Again, there are entire books multiple books written on risk management. So we just talked about it at an extremely high level. But remember that if it's occurring now, it's an issue. If there's a possibility of it occurring, that's a risk. So risk was introduced and was the primary focus of this chapter. We defined risk as both an IT level and a non-IT level. We discussed how to assess a risk, both quantitatively and qualitatively, which you need to understand for the exam. At the core, any risk assessment is an asset, and an asset is an object or material that has value to an organization. The next key aspect of what a risk is a threat. So a threat is any set of circumstances that may cause damage or harm to an asset. We discussed the need for an accurate and up-to-date assessment and inventory. We then moved on to asset classification and how classifications can help determine what the level of protection of an asset against a threat. So essentially, some assets are more important, and we accept different levels of threat depending on what that asset is. So ownership was the next topic. We defined the difference between the risk owner and the asset owner. Everything identified risk needs to have a response. So every identified risk needs to have a response. There are 4 standard risk responses: mitigate, acceptance, avoidance, and transfer. Then we discussed the importance and needs of documentation to be compliant and laws and regulations, and finding the documentation that is produced whenever a risk event occurs, finding flow from an investigation, and 4 types of investigation can occur. A risk register is the document that details and identifies the risk to an organization. It's a tool that is used by management to help formulate the appropriate risk response to each identified risk. And then we briefly introduced the vendor lock and data portability as 2 more risks that are associated with the cloud. The cloud plays a significant role in both topics, and you need to be aware of its potential impact. We also introduced 4 tools and the concept that will help mitigate the impact of both vendor lock-in and data portability. Data privacy was discussed, and then we need to know what GDPR and the requirements. And then we introduced the policies and procedures and the difference between the two. Again, remember, policies are how we set up rules for how things will happen, and then the procedures are how do we follow those steps and to ensure that we're running the organization in the way that we want to. All right, so now we're going to go through our exam essentials. Remember, this is like our flashcards that lets us know what we know and lets us know where we need to focus. Definitely before you get through that, ready for that exam, this is the area that you'll probably want to spend the most time because it'll give you a great opportunity to see, oh, yeah, I need to go back and review that, or give you the confidence to let you know that you do know the thing. So here we're going to start with know what compliance is. So compliance consists of the actions an organization takes to be compliant with laws and regulations that govern the industry and the industry that the organization operates in, state or country an organization operates in. So again, compliance is depending on what type of industry you're in, has different levels of compliance and rules that it has to follow. Know what risk is and what the 3 parts are. So risk is the probability of the occurrence of a threat. A threat is any condition or circumstance that can cause harm, damage, or loss of an asset. And then an asset is the item or material that has value to an organization. Know the difference between quantitative and qualitative analysis. Quantitative analysis is the analysis of the value of an asset that is based on monetary value, also known as a tangible asset. And then qualitative analysis is the analysis of the value of an asset based on its perceived quantities. So the analysis is often done by experts who have experience with the asset that are able to compare assets to other assets and prove a perceived value. Know the importance of an asset inventory. Risk is all about protecting assets. An organization needs to have an accurate and timely asset inventory to protect against threats. Asset inventory examples are hardware, software, and data. It's kind of like if you're going to get insurance on something, you want to have a list of all the things that you're going to get insurance on. Know what risk classification means and the importance to the level of protection. So, all identified risks should be classified and ranked against other risk. This ranking or grading will help determine the appropriate risk response and also work as a check mechanism with other risk. Know what ownership is and the difference between the risk owner and the asset owner. So the risk owner will be a member of the management who decides the risk response to an identified risk. The asset owner will be more technical and have the expertise to manage an asset. They can be the same person but don't have to be. Know the four risk responses. So mitigation, this is reducing risk through action. Well, Um, let's see, mitigation is reducing risk through actions of expenditure of resources. Acceptance means that the organization chooses not to reduce the risk. Avoidance is the removal of the risk. And then transfer means that the third party accepts the risk. Know the importance of documentation and be able to give examples. So, documentation is a requirement to be in compliance with the laws and regulations. Finding in a Findings in a risk register are two examples of often required documentation. Know the impact of vendor lock in and data portability in the era of the cloud. So, utilizing resources in the cloud has an inherent risk of vendor lock in. CSPs will not make it easy for you to switch or move between different CSPs. CSPs cannot hold data hostage, but they don't have to make it easy for you to port your data or to another vendor either. They can also charge you more. So, some vendors may charge very little to move your data in, but then if you want to bring it out, they charge a lot. And that's another way that they try to get you not to leave them. Know the difference between policies and procedures. So, policies give direction, guidance, and provide goals for an organization. Procedures provide specific steps to achieve or work towards a goal. Know the importance of standard operating procedures or SOPs. So, standard operating procedures can shorten the time involved in basic troubleshooting to come to issue resolution quickly. Know the importance of change and resource management. Change management is the process of managing change for an organization when consuming cloud resources. Changes must increase the value of the benefit or the benefit to the organization in some fashion where there is corresponding level of risk. Resource management is the managing cloud resources. Compute, storage, and networking. Cloud offers additional resource and management that was not possible with on prem resources, for instance, Intune. Know the various policies discussed: security, access and control, department specific, and communication policies. So each one of these policies plays a different role in risk management. Security is at the top level and should be organized organization wide. Each subsequent policy adds on another layer that helps manage risk. Know the steps for incident response. The steps are detection, identification, and response and reporting, and the recovery and recommendation. Sorry, those are three different steps. It's identification, and then the second step is response and reporting, and then the third step is recovery and remediation. Understand how the workflow goes from one step to another step. Know the three basic rights of an ACL or an access control list: read, write, and execute are the rights that move advanced ACLs are built on. Understand how these can be generically applied to a non-technical asset as well. All right, so that is everything in chapter 6. And then whenever you're reviewing, the chapter is pages 215 to 244. All right, here's our written lab. And again, these you may not know the first time, but they're good practice to help you make sure that you're remembering the material, not just being able to choose the best answer. So blank is the probability or likelihood of the occurrence or realization of a threat. Risk. Blank is an agent, condition, or circumstance that would potentially cause harm, loss, damage, or compromise to an IT asset or data asset. The likelihood of the threat is probability of occurrence or the odds that the event will actually occur. That's threat. Blank is an item of value to an institution, such as data, hardware, software, or physical property. An asset is an item or collection of items that has quantitative or qualitative value to a company. Asset. Blank and blank risk assessments are used to assign value to an asset. Quantitative and qualitative. Blank is determine appropriate action once a risk has been determined. Risk response. Blank are thoughts, ideas, or principles that give a direction for actions to be performed by individuals or organizations as a whole. Policies. Blank are set of steps that should be taken once an event takes place or steps that need to be taken to follow a policy. Procedures. Blank is a document that defines the scope of security needed by an organization and discusses the assets that require protection and the extent to which a security solution should go to provide the necessary protection. Security policy. Blank policies are policies that dedicate or dictate the mechanism and level of interaction between two or more assets owned by an organization. Access and control. And then finally, blank is the process of controlling planned events that are aimed at increasing value for an organization while also minimizing risk. Change management.